Bonjour à tous et merci pour
Good
cette
morning
présentation.
all, and thank you for this presentation. I mean, it was highly interesting for us, and as a major part of this audience working with the low carbon level, to have another look over the situation. The objective is for you to be able to ask your questions, but for you to have time to prepare it. I've got a first question to ask, which is quite a general one. We very often talk about compensation and contribution. So on the presentation, these two words were used. So, Simon, you used the word contribution, and can you explain to us why does this change? What initiated it physically, and what it entails in terms of communication for companies? Thanks, Hugo. Yes, I mean, there's a general change in terminology. The implication is not just for the project, but for the companies in the way they communicate. And compensation entails that a company emitting will cancel out its emission with sequestration tonnage, when contribution means that separating the both better, and in communication to say, okay, we emit, and next to that we contribute, but we don't take one away from the other, we don't mix the two. And just to conclude, I think in the way the companies calculate their emission, that's never been the case. When there's a carbon footprint, there's never they never take away the emissions. So there shouldn't be a wrong interpretation on that. And there's this change in words, which is quite good to separate things clearly, but it's not a revolution in the way we do things, because terms and low carbon labels can be associated with compensation or contribution, likewise, knowing that we tend to move towards contribution more and more. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to raise your hand, and then we'll hand the floor to you. If not, I've got more questions to ask you. So anybody in the audience having a question to ask? Yes, madam. Got a question for the representative of the Basque Association dealing with carbon sequestration issues. I would like to know if in the calculation that was done, we take into consideration, I'm not a specialist at all from a mathematical standpoint. I think that you should use you must use computers a lot, and these tools implement the use of rare earth, use of energy, critical from the protection of the environment. I'd like to know whether you've taken into consideration the negative collateral effects in your calculation or not.
Vale, supongo que le traducirán. No,
not taken that into consideration in the calculation so much as in the management. When we deal with the management, we calculate then in this management how much is emitted, and that could compensate its carbon footprint, developing the tools we use.
Et même si je peux me permettre de compléter, en termes
I'll add on to that. In terms of scale, I mean, we're far away from the impact of IT tool use. If the scale is much inferior, when we take into consideration the sequestration that a forest can do on a whole year, for instance, of calculation in the low carbon level, that's not taken into consideration. And this computer will be used to calculate the carbon element, but not just that. So that's not something that we've taken into consideration, and I think the scale of it's not relevant or very, very little relevant. Yes, sir? We've seen that all the systems presented to us take into consideration the case of afforestation, and you take into consideration the change in the use of land. How do you combine the both? Do you articulate the both?
Thank you for the question. So, indeed, the ultimate goal of the certification framework is to upscale carbon removals to the point that we reach eventually climate neutrality by 2050 at the latest, as enshrined in the European climate law. When it comes to the LULUCF, of course, if one engages in a carbon farming project, like you said, afforestation or forest management or reduction of emissions from agricultural soils or any of the sort, this will, of course, this should be reflected in the LULUCF monitoring. Because the LULUCF, I think I've mentioned it before, it's a regulation that covers emissions and removals from the land sector, land use change and forestry. And it comes forward with certain targets for member states and the EU as a whole. However, the monitoring systems put in place by the majority of member states today is not yet precise or detailed enough to have a really detailed and timely idea of what's going on in there. We are currently mostly at what we call, I'm not talking for all member states, but on average we are at what we call, at the level that we call tier 1. That means that oftentimes you will see that for reporting into greenhouse gas inventories, many will use a general emission factor for a large area, and that of course comes with a large margin of error. The revised LULUCF regulation that kicked in, that entered into force last year, and with the revision of the governance regulation, which is the basic act for all climate reporting at the level of the EU into the greenhouse gas inventories, including the UNFCCC, so into the Paris Agreement, if you will, imposed or brought in a new requirement that from 2030 on, at the latest, member states need to increase this level of detail and accuracy and timeliness for many of the categories, for example, areas of high carbon stock, areas under high climate risk, for example, areas of high biodiversity value and protection and stuff and things like that. There's a whole list in the governance regulation, Annex 5. And when the member states reach that level of accuracy and detail, which is called tier 2 or tier 3 levels, so that means that you have an emission factor highly localized for a very limited area that is dependent on management practice, on the local climate, on soil type and things like that. There are many factors to count in. When we get to tier 3, which we want to do, and it will become mandatory as of 2030 onwards, it will be at that point in time when you will be able to, so whatever carbon farming project one does that sequesters carbon, you will see it reflected in the greenhouse gas inventories, because the monitoring, the LULUCF monitoring, will detect it. And that's the ultimate goal, so that we see it in there. And once this level of monitoring is achieved, it will be also much easier to do any kind of certification, obviously, and it will also reduce costs, because you will have a general monitoring system that you can use for many, many objectives, including reporting, including certification, for example. Thank you.
Est-ce que je peux compléter la réponse
Can I add on to this question? I mean, it's quite disconnected, I'd say. The LULUCF is an inventory checking what is being done by the states, taking into consideration different policies being used. It's like the NGP of a country being measured. There are different incitements to carry carbon projects, which could be the results of the companies, which are compiled and listed in the inventory. But both systems are quite different, and the scales are so different that there are efforts being made to converge the both, but I mean we're still far from that. Yes, William Caudron, responsible for the forest and biodiversity in the Gascogne National Regional Park. How can we inform the elected representatives better, the local representative, regional, departmental ones, or even at the level of the cities, because the evolution progress is fast, and how could they best understand this mechanism, which is highly interesting and with a high potential on the territories, but it's the same as this assembly here today. I don't think that we have a lot of elected representatives being present, and I'm sorry to see that. How could we better involve elected representatives and make them aware of this issue? First element of answer, even if the question is not an easy one to answer. One of the tools of territorial climatic policies, the PCAET, which are used to implement action plans, and the forest is included in this PCAET. So a link that can be done between initiatives such as the low carbon level and territorial policies at communal level, it has to be done within the PCAET. Anybody would like to add on to this? Maybe an example. Hugo, can you tell us about the approach you have with the Gironde department, where there's a true determination to have a low carbon level label? They're meeting this morning, actually, but the Gironde department with the CNPF and the ADEME try and create a dynamic approach within the territories on their department with the DO and CISFEM to try and create a dynamic of low carbon, to associate these low-carbon label projects and the territory. So they organize animation days, and they try and meet the elected representatives to create this dynamic approach, this momentum to be able to tackle low-carbon projects. And Atlena organizes awareness sessions. So if you have meetings with your elected representative where you want us to help you to talk about the low carbon question or the sequestration, call on us and we'll be there. Another added information, just to tell you that the low carbon label is not the alpha and omega of the climate policies at regional level. It can help you to reach private funds to sequester carbon, but there are also all the other public policies at different other levels. So you should see that as an extra tool to be coordinated with the current ongoing policies. Yes, how we can organize ourselves with the territorial institutions and policy. We can have different goals. I mean, like for instance, reforestation in the Gascogne forest. In the park, we want to keep the meadow spaces, which contributes to the diversification of landscape, which is important. And every time you have the low carbon level, and the elected representatives won't know what it means, and they will wonder about the legitimacy of the low carbon level. So this low carbon level has got to be really framed and organized at local level. Yes, the bois non-pré is the non-meadow wood. I mean, it's to do with the work done on soil. So when there's a soil work which is important for this forest, I mean, we emit GHG. So there's this issue plus that of biodiversity. Then Simon talked about it. The low carbon level is at its early stages. So extra criteria specifically about meadows will be added on. So we're making progress step by step. I mean, the forestry level makes progress with this label, and the updates are being made and will continue being made with the years to come. Thanks. Oui, Adeline. Yes, Adeline Giraud of the Foresters of the Western Region. A question for Mr. Kraskik. In the genesis of the European regulation that you presented to us, in the reasons you listed, or you mentioned a lack of trust about the current labels and the necessity to increase the trust at European level, with commitments which are quite heavy going as far as the methodology, the expert groups working for a certain period of time. Parallel to that, we've seen different initiatives at local level which were very interesting. My question is, hasn't the Commission considered, instead of creating a new system, to grant a label, to have an EU label to the current system, to accredit them somehow, in as much as the current systems are fit to meet the requirement of local demands and requirements? Any thoughts on that?
Thank you for these very important questions. Yes, of course, we had a lot of discussion about that, and I have to reflect on the presentation by my colleague Simon here, and thanks a lot for that. I specifically want to refer to your last slide on the conclusions, where you said that we do not want to reinvent the wheel, and I'm very happy that we use exactly the same language as I did in my presentation. Indeed, we are not trying to reinvent the wheel, and therefore one of the first tasks of this expert group was to bring together everything that's already out there and see the pros and cons, see how it works, see where it doesn't work. We are very well aware of the regional specific circumstances, and that's why we also introduced the concept of standardized baseline, which should be highly representative of the local conditions, be it climate, soil type, elevation, all these different aspects. I take very good note of your concerns, and also I think I've heard it before today, that why not attribute like a sort of an accreditation to the existing schemes, namely the Label Bas Carbone. I think it's important to understand that there is, what we are trying to achieve here is a EU-wide certification framework. There are many of the benefits to such a framework. One is that it can be recognized all over the European Union. It is institutionalized, so that means that it's a regulation at the EU level, and that induces a lot of trust. If you have an EU-level certification system, it also allows you to transfer those certification units among member states, so it's not localized anymore. You have a big market for it. And I would also like to draw our attention to the fact that there is not just the Label Bas Carbone that it's out there. There are many other schemes. You have schemes in Germany, you have schemes all over Europe. And of course, we need to find like a common denominator to all of them, but we cannot just attach the entire system to the Label Bas Carbone. Of course, we draw a lot of inspiration from the Label Bas Carbone because it's also one of the widely used ones in France. But as such, we need to create something that is EU-wide. We've heard a lot today about biodiversity, and I'm very happy to hear that also from my colleague Aitor and Simon, and all the speakers talked about also from Galicia. We've heard a lot about biodiversity co-benefits and how biodiversity is important, and this will be also one of the very important aspects of the quality criteria and of the certification methodologies. We all know that high levels of biodiversity not only mean biodiversity per se, but it's also to increase the resilience of our land sector, the resilience of the forest to the existing and future climate change, and we will need that if we want to ensure stable sinks, stable carbon removals, but not only carbon removals, because also the livelihoods of the foresters depend on that forest, and it depends on what they plant today and what they do today in their forest. So this is one of the big priorities there as well. So just to conclude, yes, of course, we are aware of everything that's already out there, of the many aspects and approaches, but we need to find a common denominator, and there is simply the schemes that are already out there will probably need to adjust to a certain level so that they can be certified under the EU regulatory framework as well. Thanks.
Good morning, Julien Météro from Brive. I think that many certified groups noticed this year and last year the difficulty to find auditors for FSC projects. The multiplicity of audits on certification of carbon absorptions, isn't it going to increase the difficulty in finding auditors? Simon and Laurie? I can try to answer. It's also the case for international standards. We had exchanges recently with Vera. She's saying that they have issues in finding auditors in Europe to certify Vera projects. For the low carbon label, I don't think there's a problem. The criteria to be open is just to be independent and competent. And today the first auditors we see emerging are organisms type of PEFC that are present in the territories, and they should be able to meet the demand. And again, I hope that in my presentation I explained, since the low-carbon methods have a very strong framework, the audits, there's a procedure, of course, but it's a 1 or 2 day audit, when in a Vera project is 2 weeks of work. So it's reassuring because the audit can go faster, not because it's not as well done, because already parameters are set in the methodology, so there are few things to still be checked. And in the low carbon label, it's a unique audit. In other methods, with verifications every 5 or 10 years, you need to come back each time. So it makes the operation more complex. This is a question I keep asking. We see more and more criticisms on ex-ante to generate carbon credits before the sequestration occurs in the forest. So for the low-carbon label, do you think this is something that is being questioned and that could change? Maybe not next year, but in the 5, 10, 15 years to come? This is a very interesting question. We see that this is specific to the low-carbon label to have ex-ante credits, and that this is just the beginning of a debate that could change these credits. Technically, it's possible. There are new methods that were just validated. I'm thinking of the Ville Arborée in France, which certifies the tree in the city, and in fact, it's based on a system where you have ex-ante credits that are transformed into ex-post credits as time goes by. And without spoiling the presentation of this afternoon, it's a case place in the English system. So I think it's interesting. We have some ex ante, but that becomes that are being transformed because you have later verifications. So this is one solution.
I think that's a very pertinent question, and we had a lot of discussion about ex post and ex ante. Well, finally, when it comes to the European Carbon Removal Certification Framework, the co-legislators, so the Parliament and the Council, eventually decided to go for an ex post issuance of the certificate. That means that the certificates are only issued when the carbon has been already stored. So this is the way the European framework is now set, but that doesn't mean that you don't, in advance, of course, you need to have quite a good idea of how much carbon a certain project will be able to store.
Et juste, Aitor, pour continuer sur ce...
Aitor, to continue on ex ante and ex post in your presentation, Aitor, in your system, every time it's after the audit that the carbon credits are generated. When does the funding happens for the owner? This is a question for the forest, where most of the cost is at year zero at the time of planting. If you have to wait for 20 years to receive a major part of the funding, the owners are going to be discouraged, and they're not going to wait for 20 years.
Sí, está previsto que los propietarios sí que puedan percibir de antemano algo de dinero, porque si no, no están interesados.
It's provided that the owners are going to get some money beforehand, even if the forest project is a long-term project. We have good management, and we can advance the funds, because we know that the wood market is a long-term market, but we need to advance the funds. If not, it's too long. I don't know whether everybody can do it, but at least part of them. Gradually, in the next 5 years, in 5 years, there'll be the option, and if they delivered on their promise, they can get an advance on the fund, so that at the end of the project, they will have a part of the funds. If an owner wants to wait, he can do so. But if we want to have some financial advance, it's possible too. So some will want to wait year 20 to obtain the funds after the audit. There are several possibilities. Good morning, Antoine Simon, University of Bordeaux. I have questions that seem stupid because I'm not in the forest environment. I'm more a public actor on the territory. I had technical questions for Simon Martel. You talked about potential carbon sequestration on 1.5 million potential. We're talking about 1 million tons per year, or for forever. As a public institution, we have a carbon balance, and we try to evaluate our carbon sink. We have land at the university. If we do this job to estimate our carbon sink, and if the figure we find is, do we compare it to a yearly balance? Should we add the yearly balance? It's not quite clear for me. Second question, the low carbon label, is it given with a minimum yield of CO2 sequestration compared to the CO2 captured? Are there methods that are more efficient than others? And within this criteria, we talked about it earlier, is the method of management of the forest is taken into account in the criteria? Does it integrate the fire risk and the risk of a negative impact compared to the benefits? And tomorrow, will these indicators be coupled with a threshold or an indicator on biodiversity? Earlier, I heard about the mix of species that could be a criteria. Is all this taken into account? And last question, sorry. Again, as a property owner, as real estate owner, can we get a label for wood in existing areas, or the label requires the funding by a company or a third party? So does it have to be a new project? If so, can we submit a project proposal as an owner to have a new project of sequestration, of planting or other type of sequestration? Thank you. That's quite a few questions. I'll try to answer. I apologize, I couldn't go into details in my presentation of the label. On the first question, it's a real question. At the scale of the project, what is estimated is what will be sequestered by the forest during 30 years, and we subtract the reference scenario. What would happen with that? What would happen without the project? And it's this 30-year assessment which is aggregated, and that gives the figure of 1.5 million tons of CO2. So it's potential, because financing and the launching of a project triggers a sequestration project. We consider that if you check it after 5 years, you can validate it, and if it's successful after 5 years, it's very probable that after 30 years it will be successful too. Many things are, if you finance a project, you project the sequestration over 30 years, the future sequestration, but with guarantees to make it effective. Among these guarantees, we have a discount. You have your calculations. There are several procedures for the calculations. It's not the local farmer, the local forest owner that will say calculated. It's validated by the local authorities. So, based on this estimation, you remove what we call the discounts. They're automatic discounts. You remove, it's like an insurance. And there are discounts that depend on the risks. So this goes to your second or third question. The risks are assessed in comparison with the PDPFCE. They are risk mapping. We don't reinvent the wheel, but we use this mapping to assess the fire risk. And based on that, you have a discount of 5 to 15%, which and the conclusion is yes, some projects will burn down, will be subject to fire, but the projects that we emit will be compensated. And with this discount, at the end, you will have the total sequestration quantity. Question on differences between the methods. Are any methods more efficient? Yes, of course. There's no prerequisite or minimum threshold in the low-carbon label, but yes, we see, and we are treating processing the data, and we see that some projects generate more credits, more certificates. The forestation is the first one, and then the reconstitution, and then finally the wood marking to improve the quality of the wood. So I will have to check the figures. On biodiversity, there are two ways to handle it. There are compulsory, mandatory criteria not to damage it. The global principle is you must not damage the biodiversity. So it's a do no significant harm principle. So there are criteria of eligibility, and then the co-benefits, it's for what comes extra. So it's both based on science, and it's simple to measure, and there's a compromise between the two. We could have exhaustive inventory, but it's not the objective. The purpose is to have simple things. And on your last question, you as an owner, can you propose new things? The answer is yes. Today, any actor can propose new methods if you don't find if you're not happy with the existing methods. But many work is being done currently for new methods. I briefly mentioned them. Do they meet your requirements? So in that case, it's not necessary to do anything similar. If it's not the case, if you have an idea for a new method, you should inform the Ministry of Environment, and they will tell you whether there are any similar things, if it's relevant, and then why not launch work to design a new method, keeping in mind that this work takes several years. It must involve all the stakeholders, the researchers, the project leaders, environmental associations, to have something collective that in the end will have an impact and have a potential for a real project. If you have an impact on only 4 projects on 5 hectares, it won't. Okay. My third question is not to propose a new method, but to propose hectares so that a project is happening in our land. Yes, of course you can do it yourself. Today there are many intermediaries who connect owners with financing companies, and they coach the owners to set up projects. And to know these intermediaries, you can go to the info platform, which has a list of the intermediaries for low-carbon project. And very last question, you talked about 30 years. It means that the owners commit not to cut down the trees for 30 years to reach the potential, right? Before handing over to Daniel, I would like to complement that. Okay, not cut down the trees for 30 years, but you must you cannot have a full cutting, but you can have a clearing. To maximize sequestration, in the majority, the forestation generates more sequestration than reforestation. Because if it's burned down, you already have a forest soil. But when you have so much there is as much carbon in the biomass as in the soil. So you don't add carbon to the soil. So there is less sequestration and credit generation. Back to the first question, you talked about 30 years. You represent the University of Bordeaux. If you do your carbon balance every year, you're going to finance a project in adequation with these emissions. And this sequestration will be calculated over 30 years, but for you it will be used only in your carbon balance for the year. So you need to repeat that every year. Daniel, can you hear us? I'm not sure. Yes, I do hear you. Questions of biodiversity are mentioned in your presentation. In your projects, you finance carbon credits, but you have a strong interest for biodiversity. How can you estimate the best scenario, since it's not the same issues for carbon sequestrations and biodiversity. So how do you make a selection? The carbon market process, we use a forest certification process, and a lot of work is being done. And we now use the sediment economic reports. For small customers who want compensations, the conditions, the indicators they can follow are not very high, and they trust the system and the ministry, but it depends on their attitude each year, and we don't have a yearly review, of course. But we have working groups to specify with what indicators we can show that they reached certain objectives or the needs in different areas in their forests. Some forests are near cities, others are far away. For instance, there are forests on the Santiago de Compostela way, Pilgrim's Way, so they need to be protected. And in that case, there are different criteria or different phases based on these reports and certification criteria. And there are different steps in the project, but those being used normally are those that are important for the audit. I'm not sure I answered your question.
Oui, si, en partie, je vois ce que vous voulez dire. Et oui, pour Yuri et le CRCF, il y a une notion qui est quand même assez importante et nouvelle sur dans les crédits carbone, c'est l'aspect temporaire qu'on voit apparaître au niveau du CRCF. Moi, je me demande quel va être l'impact pour les entreprises justement dans leur calcul de bilan carbone et aussi dans leur volonté d'acheter ces crédits, parce qu'ils sont à terme du coup voués à, on va dire, disparaître. Comment d'ailleurs comment va concrètement se passer cette disparition
How will it disappear when there will be at the end of the audit for agricultural or forest projects?
Thanks for the question. So indeed, we had a lot of discussion on these temporary credits and whether they should be permanent or not. Eventually, the co-legislators decided to introduce this temporary nature of the certified units when it comes to carbon farming. There is a fine line to tread between how long you want your activity period to be, and how long, of course, the EU should strive towards as long a period as possible. But then you also have to make it feasible for land managers, because it's oftentimes very difficult to conclude a contract that is very long in time. So we had to find the right balance there. However, for the companies, if they want to, so indeed, if the operator decides to stop the monitoring, then the certified unit will expire, and this will also be visible in the certification registry, as well as the reason for expiration. So it will not, well, but if it's in the interest of the project owner or those that finance it to continue to keep this certificate, to keep the unit, the certificate, of course they are very welcome, they are able and also very much encouraged to extend the monitoring period. And in that way, you can extend it indefinitely and the certificate will not expire. So on the one hand, this makes it feasible to conclude contracts with land managers, with farmers, with foresters. On the other hand, it gives the possibility to extend it as long as there's interest to keep the certified units. And it also provides a business opportunity further down the line for the forest owners, for the land managers to continue doing a good job.
Ok. Est-ce que je peux rebondir sur la question?
Can I react on that?
On l'a aussi identifié
Because
cette
we
question,
also
et
identified
c'est aussi
this
du côté
question.
De la demande. Alors, on a bien compris que
We
les
understand
certificats
that
CRCF
the CRCF certificates
visent plusieurs usages.
Are have many uses, but the first use, in the short term at least, is a voluntary carbon market. And there is a question on whether the companies will want to buy temporary certificates. Aren't they going to be criticized for doing so? Because if they buy a 10-year credit, in theory, they're supposed to renew it after 10 years. So they can have an accumulation of certificates. How do you see, for the Commission, the demand for temporary credits?
So the framework comes up with three possible carbon removals techniques, if you will. There's carbon farming, there's permanent removals, and carbon storage and products, right? The industrial removals, so the so-called permanent removals, are the ones that are permanent, but they also cost quite a bit currently. And there is a lot of, when it comes to carbon farming, there is a lot of capacity. We've seen a lot of capacity there, for example, when it comes to forest management, when it comes to carbon sequestration in soil organic carbon, when it comes to rewetting of wetlands and peatlands, as I pointed out this morning. We've also seen a lot of interest in the carbon farming, and that's why we wanted to include this into the certification mechanism as well. Of course, it comes with challenges that we need to overcome, and therefore we have created a different group that is a bit different than the permanent removals, because it comes with certain, you need to think about some additional aspects and some additional rules to it. But in terms of capacity, in terms of costs, and in terms of what interest we see out there for these carbon farming certification units, we expect quite a lot of demand also on that aspect.
Sophie Blanchard, FIBO Nouvelle-Aquitaine,
Sophie Blanchard, Interprofession New-Aquitaine. I have two questions. The first one about the forest soil. For the time being, we talked about in the framework of the European regulation, we talked about the storage in the biomass, permanent soil sequestration. Is it? Can you quantify it? There must be a current research. Eventually, is it going to be approached? Second question. Simon talked about the context for the low carbon label with less public aid. So I'm wondering whether the baseline at the time have changed. And are they going to change? And how this change in the baseline scenarios, is this taken into account or not? Thank you.
On the long-term storage in soils, it's exactly for this reason that we have brought in this concept of a temporary certification unit, because the carbon stored in soils, as we've seen in many examples, and also experts came to us, so that eventually the co-legislators decided to create a temporary certification unit for carbon stored in, for soil organic carbon stored in soils. But I can reiterate once again that if a certain project manager or operator wants to extend the activity and monitoring period, this can be extended endlessly. In essence, it can be extended endlessly. But you rightly point out that if we cease the monitoring period, then we cannot know whether that amount of carbon is still in there, is still stored in there. Many things can happen when it comes to agricultural land. And therefore, if the operator ceases the monitoring period, then it's logical that the temporary, it's by definition, a temporary nature of the certificate is that it expires eventually. And exactly for this reason, that's why we came in with this concept. So there is no such thing as long-term storage in soils, as legally speaking, as part of this framework. On your second question, I don't know whether that was for me as well, or the baseline, so I can, but maybe then you can complement from the label bas carbone point of view. Indeed, baselines are something that we pay a lot of attention to. We want to come up with, so when we talk about the baselines, there are two things to keep in mind, I think. One is that we need accurate baselines that will really reflect what's going on in the area of the project. But then, at the second time, we also need to take into account the administrative burden and costs, and therefore we need to find a very fine balance between those two. And that's why we, in the certification framework, allow for two different concepts of the baseline. One, the more favored one, so to speak, is the default value, if you will. The default one is the standardized baseline. And the standardized baseline should reflect, should be highly representative, as it states in the text, should be highly representative of the local circumstances. It should reflect, differences in soil types, climate, terrain, social aspects, also regulatory aspects. And if once we have the standardized baselines in place, it has many benefits. One of the major benefits is that an operator can take it for granted and at no additional cost. The other benefit is also that you don't penalize those that have been already doing a good job, so the front runners, those that might have bigger concentrations of carbon already in their habitats, already in their ecosystems, because a standardized baseline will then not take that into account and will reflect the good job that the front runner has already been doing. Of course, if you want to get another certificate after 10, 20, 30 years to account for more removal, then this baseline will need to be readjusted. That makes it clear, because double counting, for example, was one of the major discussions that we had, and it was quite clear from all points of view that double counting is something that needs to be taken into account very seriously. If there is no standardized baseline, then we have a fallback scenario to come up with a project-specific baseline, and it's for the certification scheme in the whole certification process that we also touched upon today, and you will see it also on the slides, because I hope the presentation will be circulated. It's then the certification scheme that can, with monitoring, with sampling, with remote sensing, however, this will be defined in the methodologies, that can establish a project-specific baseline for a certain project. But we, just to reiterate, we strive towards the standardized baselines. That's for the European framework, EU framework, and if you want to complement. Thanks.
Merci.
Thank you. Yes, about the assessment of the soil carbon. If you plant a cultivated area with trees, you take into account the soil carbon. Scientifically, we can say that there is a substantial carbon gain when you go from a cultivated land to a forest. So you can quantify the soil carbon increase. But in other situations, we consider that the science cannot quantify the carbon impact in the soil of the low carbon label project, but we have several indicators telling us that the soil carbon is either stable or increasing. We don't take it into account, but it's a conservative measure because we probably sequester more. But there are protection measures on the work in the soil. So this is monitored because we could lose soil carbon. So we make sure that we don't take it into account and that we don't decrease it. Then I think that it can change based on the evolution of the knowledge. For the baseline and taking into account of the public aids, there is a strong assumption in the forest low carbon label is that if a forest owner, if it doesn't get more than 50% subsidies, he won't reforest. This is a simple assumption based on studies. So therefore, then the public aids can change and the label will adapt. If tomorrow a region proposes reforestation subsidy in the amount of 60%, the low carbon label won't be eligible. There's an exception with the Plan de Relance Forestier, which accompanied the forest owners with subsidies of more than 50% after diebacks. In theory, the low carbon label was not eligible, but there was an exception. The owner can choose. He cannot get both. They can either take the public assistance, public subsidy, or low carbon label. The public policies could have worked better to try to combine both, so that so that you can associate both to maximize the opportunities. Our project generated major internal discussions. And the real framework we have is so high that nothing can be done for our certification. The framework is so high that there is nothing to add. There are areas with Atlantic climate, others with different climate. In the Alava region, for instance, we have the climate criteria because if we don't have the right climate criteria, we can do anything we want, put all the species we want. We are not going to have a good result. We need to take into account the climate areas that are more important than the plot itself. We have this problem that if we consider, if we do calculations at an upper scale, it's difficult to have comparisons. And I believe that in that case, we must readjust the criteria. So a standardized baseline is better. So it's the end of this roundtable. I have many more questions to ask, but maybe later. I'm sorry, we have to break for lunch. But you can keep exchanging during lunch. This is what it's for, so don't hesitate. Keep asking questions. And thank you too.